Yeah, good afternoon. As Paul said, I'm Rob McCormack, Director at the BBA. I spent the last 2 years carrying out a lot of research, cavity wall and external wall insulation products, looking through the various stages of assessing properties for suitability, assessing the performance of insulation retrofits in situ, but also looking at any issues that may arise if there's any non-compliance within the installations or issues with the fabric of the property as well. So my presentation today is very much focused around those products and some of the challenges that the industry currently faces that we've come across, but also looking at the improvements, future improvements that we hope our clients, social housing providers, landlords of any type can take forward to improve the condition of their housing stock and oversee the projects in the most efficient ways. Okay, so this is generally the bad news part, sharing some of the stories and issues that we've found within our research. So you'll see the various images which are relating to some of the headings that you see in the form of remediation costs, litigation and so on. So I'll just pick out a few to talk you through. So litigation, we've come across instances by which social housing providers are facing challenges from, for want of a better term, no-win, no-fee solicitors who are canvassing their tenants in their properties, whose properties are in some cases in a state of disrepair. The support that we've provided to those social housing providers is providing them with impartial advice, assessing the property using a bespoke methodology to say whether the insulation retrofit, cavity wall or external wall insulation is the driver or the causation of the issues that are found within the property, and that can generally be discovered as damp condensation, mold growth, but there's so many more factors that play into that as well, which I'll touch on as I go into the presentation. I'll also pick out the point of invalid guarantees. So in some cases, it obviously is the obligation of the landlord to ensure that if they're having a guarantee in place for an installation, that they carry out a regime of property inspections and overseeing the general maintenance of properties to ensure that any requirements of the guarantee are met and therefore their guarantee remains valid. By way of some context, in the cavity wall insulation sector, guarantees are issued up to generally a lifetime of 25 years, but there is a requirement within that period for the landlords and the inhabitants of the properties to maintain the property adequately and to ensure, therefore, any adaptations to the properties don't affect the installation in situ. Okay, so I'll now talk about, in my opinion and from my experience so far, what are the steps to move the quality framework where it currently is into a position that we feel safeguards landlords and safeguards the installations that have been taking place to the properties and the overall performance of the properties. So step one, as I've highlighted, technical specifications, contracts and guarantees. All of these I'll go into some more detail in the next slide. A real focus on property suitability assessment. So this is ensuring that the property at the date that you assess it is in a condition either that requires a form of remediation to render it suitable for the installation or to ascertain whether the property is ever going to be suitable for the proposed installation. Installation compliance speaks for itself, so ensuring that the processes that lend itself to the installation methodology are carried out correctly. The products that are proposed for the installation and used they have suitable certificates in place, so they're being applied in the right way. And then through to step 4 being the end user being aware of what is being done to their property, how they need to manage their property post the installation, and then being satisfied with what's being done. But a key part to that is the knowledge of what's being done to their property. And as I touched on a little bit earlier, is an inspection regime by those that are responsible for that property, whether it's the landlord or the homeowner. Okay. So just a bit more detail about the benefits of those 5 steps. So technical specifications, dare I say we see some instances by which clients aren't necessarily clear with the contractors carrying out the works on exactly the specification they want them to meet. So we see this is a real area of improvement to make sure between the client and the contractors responsible for the works, there's a clear understanding of the technical specifications, and ensuring that during that process of installing the work and assessing the work at quality assurance stage is that the specification has been met. Both parties agree to that. As important, the contractual terms, so they're linked from the client to the contractor to quality assurance and also to delivery of the technical specifications that have been initially agreed. Back to an early point that I mentioned about the guarantees, so dare I say, generally being the bearer of bad news in these circumstances, we come across issues where people part with significant sums of money to improve the thermal efficiencies of their properties and expect that there's a guarantee in place for 20, 30 years or more, and in some cases, by not understanding the limitations of that guarantee, are left in quite a vulnerable position because they fail to maintain the property as they should, and when situations start to arise and defects start to arise in the property themselves, they then revert back to the guarantee in hope that that will solve the issues and assist them with remediation, to sometimes discover that they haven't carried out their obligations and the guarantees aren't necessarily going to deliver the resolutions that they hope. Property assessment, so this is something I will always stay true to, and we generally link this to the outset of the problems. So we see many examples where properties aren't necessarily assessed adequately in our opinion, and that's where maybe the entities that are involved in that process sometimes aren't necessarily the best placed. There can be conflicts of interest. Our proposed way of dealing with that process is for someone, a third party, a suitable third party, to assess housing stock or in a specific dwelling, to make sure in its current position it's suitable, but to also identify any remediation needs, which takes me on to my next point. Those remediation needs that are required to render the property suitable, and that the property going forward for the intended works is in the best possible condition and the most suitable condition to receive the installation retrofit install. And then on to work in progress quality assurance. So it is what it says, ensuring that whether it's a third party or someone that's employed by the social housing provider, to ensure that the works are being delivered to the agreed technical specifications, that eventually in delivering that they will deliver the outcomes of the contracts and that everyone's agreed to, and that there's specific checks carried out during this process, to ensure that the specification is met and that the contractor delivers a requirement of the product itself and the agreement certificate. As I touched on earlier on, client satisfaction, we see too many instances, in my opinion, where clients know what's being done to their property, but don't really know the detail of what's being done to their property. So in the example of cavity wall insulation, once it's inserted into the cavity of the property, you can't see it. You can see externally if by the drilling pattern if it's been applied in the correct manner, but you can only check the quality of that installation by an intrusive inspection, what we refer to as a borescope inspection. So customers don't generally have borescopes, they don't know necessarily what the process is. By assessing the inside of the cavity in the example of cavity wall insulation, so they're left at the mercy of the contractors, who we would hope would have done the works properly, and in most cases we would hope have delivered that technical specification. In the example of external wall insulation, it's more visible to the customer, so it's easier to see defects, and it's easier to understand whether the quality assurance standards have been met. But again, we're relying on someone the homeowner, who generally aren't experts, to be able to understand what's been done to their property, but also to understand how the property needs to be maintained and what a good installation looks like. Which leads me on to my next point around the guidance that's issued and the obligations in regard to property maintenance. And then to my last point that I touched on earlier, which is an inspection regime. An inspection regime which conforms to the requirements of the guarantees, ensures that the property is maintained adequately, a reasonable frequency, to deliver the best outcomes of the investment that's been made into making the property more thermally efficient, but also you would hope joined by the homeowner knowing how they need to manage the property following the installation, and the person who's responsible for the property, whether it be the homeowner or the landlord, carrying out their obligations, all puts us into a place by which the right investment has been made to the property benefits to its full capacity from that investment, and the property is maintained adequately to give it the best, most longest lifespan. Okay. So I just wanted to talk through some examples of where, in our opinion, we see examples of, in this case, social housing providers specifically taking what we feel are really, really positive steps in this area. So all of these images that you see here, you'll see on the next slides as well, but I'll just give you a little bit of context, background about these projects. So I mentioned to you I've spent the last 2 years at the BBA conducting research into these insulation retrofit products, cavity wall and external wall insulation. And I'll touch on this example here of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, who have taken a real leap here, a real leap of faith and a really brave step in liaising with us and requesting us to carry out research to a proportion of their housing stock. Now, the research is still ongoing at the moment, so I can't necessarily reveal too much of the detail, but it's groundbreaking research as far as cavity wall insulation is concerned. And the methodology that we've applied to assessing the dwellings is really taking into consideration the condition of the fabric of the property and the relationship it may or may not have in some cases to the condition of the cavity wall insulation. In this particular research, we've had a panel of industry experts and academics that are supporting, overseeing the project, the running of the project and the governance of the project. And when the results are released later this year, the housing executive are confident that it will give them really clear guidance on how they implement and manage future strategies in this area. So, putting it simply, them understanding by carrying out assessments of a representative sample of their housing stock could be applied across their entire housing stock that may have these cavity wall insulations in place, and giving them the information required on how to adequately maintain their properties, ensure they're maintained at the correct frequency, and to ensure they're making cavity wall insulation investments, housing improvement investments at the right stages. My next example is Southampton City Council. So this is where 27-storey block, Canberra Towers, located on the estuary on the seafront in Southampton, one of 5 blocks located in this area. 4 of which already had external wall insulation applied, which had generally been performing as it needed to, but there had been some issues that the social housing provider had come up against around some defects that had arisen. So with the last remaining block, they wanted to carry out some due diligence, and in this specific project, we supported them with carrying out intrusive inspections of 144 of the flats that laid within the dwelling. And that was assessing the current condition of the internal condition of the flats, ensuring that they were adequately ventilated. Was there any signs of defects around windows, doors? Was there any examples of damp condensation, etc.? So they could be adequately maintained, but also prepared for readiness of a potential external wall insulation installation. Also externally, we used drones to photograph the external condition of the buildings, and we employed some very brave individuals to abseil down the sides of the building. That wasn't me, not brave enough, but some very brave individuals to abseil down the buildings with direction from the drones and our technical staff on the ground to assess specific areas that we felt were areas of concern. So all in all, we were able to deliver outcomes back to the clients to say, this is the condition internally of the flats, and externally, this is what we propose in terms of a form of remediation. So they could then devise a scope of works that could prepare the dwelling for the installation and be clear on the budget of that installation as well. So they knew what the cost would be up front for preparation, and then they would look to what the cost of the works were, but also, as importantly, understanding the requirements to maintain the properties post the installation as well. So my last example here is the Vale of Glamorgan. It's titled Future-Proofing Homes. So this is the Vale of Glamorgan looking back at what they've done in the past, especially in the cavity wall insulation area, where generally it was a routine to insulate properties as long as they were of the construction type that would allow cavity wall insulation to be installed. But take into consideration the locality of their properties and their exposure to excessive rainwater, they were seeing a number of issues arising. So by utilising drones, but utilising a bespoke inspection methodology on their properties, we did a number of things. We assessed the performance of installations in place, and we also assessed specific properties that were in highly exposed areas to understand if there was any different type of methodology they would have to employ in the future assessment of these properties, and whether they would then be suitable for installations or not. So we took our technical knowledge, shared that with colleagues within the local authority. We provided them with relevant training and confidence and on-site support to say when they're out looking at the schemes that have already been completed and looking at the future proposed schemes, that the right strategies are in place, and that they can always contact us in the event of having any technical queries. But as importantly, have the confidence to challenge any works being taken place on site, and be in the confidence that the properties are being handed back in the right condition and the installations have been done correctly.